Welcome to Generating the Wealth of Nations. I'm Jeff Borland, Coordinator for the course. I'm excited to have this opportunity to teach a course about a subject that I think is really important, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to hopefully engage with lots of you about the material in the course. I hope you find the course enjoyable and that you feel you learn a lot from doing it. In this part of the lecture, I want to give a bit of an introduction to the course. I'm going to do this by talking about some of the main themes in the history of economic development. In this graph, I've shown some data on what I've called the value of economic output per person. This is data that comes from the economic historian Angus Maddison. I'll talk in a later part of this lecture about what we mean by the value of economic output per person, but for the moment, think of it as a measure of living standards or material well-being. The graph shows data for 6 main regions in the world: Western Europe, what are called the Western offshoots, countries like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the former USSR, Latin America, Asia and Africa. And I've shown a period of history from the year 1 up to the year 1700. You can see in terms of the scale of the graph, living standards are relatively low and relatively uniform between different regions in the world. This is a period in history that's often referred to as the Malthusian era. Let's roll forward in time a bit. We get to a period called the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, which started in the mid-18th century, was a period of more rapid and persistent technological change than had been observed to occur before. This was a period when there were major improvements in technologies for producing goods like cotton and iron, and when steam power became important in production. You can see that the effect of the Industrial Revolution was that living standards in some parts of the world, Western Europe and the Western offshoots, begin to increase and begin to move away from other regions in the world. If we then continue forward to the present, we see that that trend has accelerated. In a period known as that's often referred to as the Great Divergence, we see that Western Europe and the Western offshoots have continued to grow rapidly. Other regions in the world have experienced some growth, but nowhere near as much. This means, I think, that there's 3 big questions in thinking about the history of economic development. First of all, why was there so little progress during the Malthusian era? Secondly, what explains the Industrial Revolution, this remarkable period when suddenly living standards start to increase more rapidly than it experienced at any time before? Thirdly, why has there been a great divergence? Why isn't it that living standards have increased in all parts of the world to the same extent? This third question, I think, is really 2 questions. How is it that living standards in rich countries have continued to increase after the Industrial Revolution, in fact have increased at an even faster rate? And secondly, why haven't all the poor countries caught up? These 3 questions are questions that we'll be exploring in great detail throughout the course. We're going to spend most time on the last question, the period of the Great Divergence, which is the period that leads up to where we sit today. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the themes that we'll look at during that period. If we look at the period of the Great Divergence, there have been different leaders in the value of economic output per person. Primarily from the period sort of immediately after the Industrial Revolution up to the start of the 20th century, late 19th century, England was the leading country in terms of the value of economic output per person that it produced. But then in the early 20th century, you can see that it was overtaken by the United States, and the United States became the country with the highest living standards, the highest value of economic output per person during the 20th century. So a couple of questions arise from this. One question is, what does it take to be a leader? What does it take to be the country with the most advanced economy? And then secondly, what explains the fact that there was this transfer in leadership from England to the United States around the start of the 20th century? there are some leaders, but there are also lots of followers. And so another important theme about the history of economic development during this period of economic divergence is how have other countries gone? What we observe if we look at other countries is that some of them have in fact been able to catch up to the leading countries. They've experienced increasing value of economic output per person that's meant that their living standards have approached those in the leading countries like the United States and England. Other countries, though, have had the opposite experience. This graph gives those two perspectives. So the way this graph is constructed is there's a line that you can see here which is 100 in every year. That's the United States. So basically I'm creating the United States, saying the United States has a value of economic output per person of 100 in every year. Then the numbers for the other countries in that graph are relative to the US number of 100. So if we look here, the red line is Argentina. We look back here, it's around 50. So that tells us that back in 1946, Argentina's value of economic output per person was about 50% of that in the US because the US is 100. Let's look at what's happened over time. First of all, a follower who have caught up is Japan. So if you look back after World War II, Japan's average value of economic output per person was less than 20% of that of the United States. But then in this period from World War II through to the early 1990s, Japan caught up to the point where its average value of economic output, its living standards, were 80% of those in the United States. Since then, you can see they've fallen back a little bit, but still remained a relatively rich country compared to the United States. Whereas, if we look at the experience of Argentina, the red line, you can see Argentina after World War II had value of economic output 50% of that in the US, but over the period since then has fallen to have just 35% of the value of economic output per person in the US. South Africa, which started at about 25% after World War II, has fallen to have 15%. We can get a similar perspective for a much larger group of countries from this graph. What I've done on this graph is I've put the average value of economic output per person on the horizontal axis in 1960, and then on the vertical axis I've put the rate of growth in the average value of economic output from 1960 to 2010. So countries that are further out on the horizontal axis are the countries that were richer in 1960. Countries that are closer to the vertical axis are the countries that were poorer in 1960. Countries that are higher up on the vertical axis have grown most from 1960 to 2010. Countries that are down the bottom on the vertical axis have grown least. If you look at the rich countries, you can see that they've all grown by a moderate amount from 1960 to 2010. If you then look at the countries that were poor in 1960, you can see that some of those countries have grown more than the countries that were rich. So this would be countries like China, Thailand, South Korea. But there are other countries which were poor in 1960 who have actually done worse than the countries which were rich. Not only haven't they caught up, they've fallen behind the rich countries. And so this would be countries like Nigeria, Zimbabwe and Burundi. What this tells us is that another major question about the history of economic development is why do some countries catch up to the leaders over time and why have other countries failed to catch up over time? We're going to talk a lot more about that question throughout the course, but just to give you one taste of a potential explanation that we'll address. So a big theme in the 20th century was the battle of economic systems. Was the best way to organise activity a market-based capitalist economic system, as in the US and Western Europe, or was it to have a command communist-based method of economic organisation such as the Soviet Union and China. In this graph, you can see that we now know that the answer was a market-based capitalist method of economic activity, that the economies in the Soviet Union and China failed to catch up at all to the United States during the 20th century, during the period when they had a command-based communist system of economic organisation. Since they've moved away from that type of system, and in particular if you look at China since 1980, you'll see that there's been some evidence of catch-up towards the United States. So this tells us that one potential explanation for why countries are rich and poor, why some countries catch up and some countries don't, is their method of organising economic activity. Of course, by raising that point, I don't want to give you the impression that the course is going to just be about the triumph of a market-based capitalist economy. Another theme from the 20th century is the problems that are associated with market-based capitalist economies. We know that they're susceptible to instability through business cycle fluctuations, and we know that a major theme has been concern about inequality in capitalist economies. One major episode of instability was the Great Depression. Here I've shown some data on the rate of unemployment from 1929 to 1939. And you can see that basically for a large part of the 1930s, due to the Great Depression, the United States had a rate of unemployment that was above 15%. In other words, here's an economic system through which large amounts of sort of suffering and misery are imposed on sections of the population. Here's another perspective on market-based in capitalist economies, the idea that there can be large inequality. So here's some data on the income received by the top 1% of earners during the 20th century and into the start of the 21st century. And you can see that there are large amounts of income received by the top income earners. So by the end of the data period in the 2000s, you can see in the United States the top 1% of earners were earning almost 20% of income. In countries like France and Australia, it was still 10% of income being earned by the top 1%. You can also notice sort of that since the 1970s, there seems to have been this upward trend in the amount of inequality, which actually followed sort of quite a long period of decreasing inequality. So another major theme in the course will be about the idea of civilising capitalism, the attempts by policymakers to try and deal with some of the problems that have come with capitalist market-based economies. There's one other theme I want to talk about before finishing this section of the lecture. So far I've talked about living standards through talking about the value of economic output produced. But one other feature of development that I want to talk about is demographics. First of all, world population. It turns out that around the same time that the Industrial Revolution happened, that the takeoff in living standards began, there was also a takeoff in world population. So from the year 1 through to 1700, you can see there was slow growth in population, but certainly nothing taking us to the levels of population or close to the levels of population we have today. Instead, it's around this period from 1700 that we see slowly accelerating population growth. So part of the story about the history of economic development is also going to be a story about population growth in the world. Another aspect of the demographic story has been to do with how long we live for. So the amount we have available to consume, the economic output there is, that's one aspect of our well-being. But there are other aspects as well. And perhaps the most important is the length of time we live for. And here you can see there's been huge developments as well. So if you look at England, in 1850 life expectancy was still only 40 years. 150 years later, it's 80 years. Whereas if we go back sort of previous 150 years, it had only increased by about 8 years. So in the period after the Industrial Revolution, we've also seen large increases in life expectancy. Somewhat more delayed than the changes in standard of living. You can see most of the changes occurring in the 20th century, but nevertheless, huge effects in terms of human well-being. And you can see that's extended through a variety of countries. Egypt in the 20th century, Japan, China, and so on. So this story of demographics is going to be part of the story we tell in this course as well. In the last part of this section of the lecture, I just want to give you a brief introduction to what I'll be covering in the rest of this lecture. In the next section, I'll talk about learning resources and assessment. Then I'll talk about why I think the study of the history of economic development of the world economy is so important, how we measure economic development, then what causes economic development. First of all, using the idea of technology as a framework for thinking about that question, then thinking of what are often referred to as fundamental causes as a framework for thinking about that question. And then I'll finish up with a brief overview of the material we'll be covering in the rest of the course. Before we get on to the rest of that material though, there's a video by Hans Rosling, who's a master of presenting data in clever ways that I'd like you to look at.